another foundering car, and today we will discuss the evolution of the hot hatch. And it's all started with the hatchback, of course, so that you have a convenient way to put in your stuff at the back and that can open at the hatch instead of a sedan type of car. But there's also hot in the name, so it started with hatchbacks that had sufficient power to be hot, and there were some that had a front engine rear wheel drive type of setup, some BMWs for example. I think the earlier TIs had, and that were perhaps the first hot hatches. But it all took a turn when they had the best configuration. When you look at sufficient space and at the minimum amount of weight. And what am I on about? In my opinion, a hot hatch should be attainable, so not too expensive. Yeah, that's one. And also to be not so expensive. Oftentimes a car needs to be a little bit lighter, and then you also don't need this excess of power because you still have a good power to weight. And with this different setup, so when I started this conversation, they had a front engine rear wheel drive, but they had a longer nose at the front, because the front engine rear wheel drive engine has the engine directed in this direction, so a longer nose is needed, and also then you have the transaxle and all those other components into the cabin, into the chassis, so to say, incorporated to get the power to the rear wheels. So that decreases simplicity, adds weight, and adds of course also cost, and will cut down the interior room. So you have to have a bigger car, and if you have a bigger car and bigger engine, you also need bigger brakes, etc, etc. But when they made the switch, for example with the Mini, but there were also other cars, original Mini, the concept that they have still quite good interior space, but then they had a front engine, front wheel drive, so then the engine can be placed in this direction, so the nose can be a lot shorter, and also because the power is directed at the front wheels, you could have a lot less components, and you have a lighter car to begin with, also roomier as compared to the front engine rear wheel drive setup, and also more power goes to the wheels because you have less parasitic loss and better fuel consumption, etc, etc. It would also be a lot less costly to acquire. So that's the real start of the hot hatches. And the Mini, I can imagine when you have a sufficient big engine, and they had a Cooper. John Cooper works also in those times because they drove rally with it and they were quite successful. But one of the most renowned early hot hatches was Golf GTI, also Peugeot 205 GTI are to be mentioned. And there were a lot of that. Also the predecessor of the Swift Sport that I'm driving now, the Swift GTI, was there. They all were quite light, or around 800 kilograms. Front engine, front wheel drive type of car. Oftentimes 5-speed manuals. It's now a 6-speed manual, but still very close to that. And they oftentimes had 3-door setups, so not 5 doors as they are now. Now almost all hot hatches are 5 doors because it's a lot easier. They're not 5 doors when they don't have a back seat, but if they have a back seat, they want to have 5 doors. And I like the practical element, because a hot hatch should combine the practicality of a hatchback with the hotness of a sporting type of car, sport car. That's the charm about this. And then they evolved, and even times now they go to different drivetrains again. They had the Renault 5 GT Turbo, which had a mid-engine, so they skipped the back seats and then put an engine there and then drove the rear wheels like a supercar. Yeah? That could be, or you have this Golf Rs, and then the predecessor were the Golf R32, etc, etc. That had all-wheel drive, and you also have still engines, hot hatches, the engine at the front and the driven wheels at the back, front engine rear wheel drive, they are also there. And of course, but it's not a hatchback, you had designs that had the engine at the back like the Beetle, but those were not as sporty because they had not so much horsepower, and they didn't have the convenience of a hatchback. Because if you have the engine at the back, like the Beetle has, or the 500 had the earlier incarnations, then you will lose the trunk. Whereas if you have the engine at the front, you will keep the trunk. And even if you have the engine at the back, you can of course put a little bit luggage under the hood, but that's very limited because you still need to have the cooling, etc. So this is the optimal design for a lightweight type of car. Also the 500 evolved in the Sargento and Cinquecento before that, because it was a better design for this type of car. But nowadays hot hatches are still here. It's almost a small miracle because of all this legislation, and they are prompting to have a car that has as little as possible fuel consumption, and then if you're a big baller, a supercar can still be acquired because then the tax is based on the consumption or just a fraction of the total cost oftentimes, and also those people have quite deep pockets, whereas the hot hatch was for the normal man and they don't have that deep pockets. But so it's quite a miracle that it's still alive. But a lot of the hot hatches have evolved to four-wheel drive, like the Golf RS or the Audi RS3 and the S3, which are magnificent quick cars which also have all-road traction, so you can be using all that power all the time, or even in bad conditions you can get away with a lot of traction issues because they have superior traction. And you have other cars like the Golf GTI, the newest iteration, still has a front wheel drive front engine setup, but this has become a lot heavier, and with the modern newer materials, of course, they are able to, and clever chassis designs, they are able to reduce a little bit of the weight, but the 800 kilogram range is of course far away. Also, if you look at the first generation of the sporting Swift, which had like 740 kilograms, 760 kilograms with a 101 horsepower engine, about 100 newton meters. Of course, it was a lot lighter than what I'm driving now, and this is almost 1000 kilograms, 995 kilograms. It's reduced a little bit by using this exhaust and removing some badges, but that is just marginal. But this car has double the newton meters, and easy, because there's 235 newton meters stock, and it only weighs like 200 kilograms more. So that's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. And this is still a very light type of hot hatches, and that's what I think should be the direction. It's a pity that in the A segment you only have one hot hatch, one true hot hatch, so to say, which is the Up GTI. Of course, you have Kia Picanto and I think the i10 with the turbocharged 1 liter engine, which are almost at the same performance, and also this Swift, this Up GTI has drum brakes at the back, which I don't like in a hot hatch, but okay, I can imagine because of the cost you can go that route. But if you look at the lightest and the cheapest hot hatch you can acquire with having disc brakes around, this is Swift Sport. That's a good point to begin with. And why this lightness? Because it is such a big deal. Because at this time and age, if you look at for example the Polo GTI, which is also the B segment, or the Fiesta ST, which is also the B segment type of hot hatch, or you're looking at the i20N, they're all about 20% to 25, almost 30% heavier than this car. That gives you an indication why lightness is such a luxury at this time. And then if you also imagine that this car is kitted out, you get all the goodies standard, you really have a good deal, because if you would add those goodies you will improve a upon the creature comfort, of course, but also add a little bit of weight and add additional cost. And especially in this day and age where you're penalized when you have poor fuel consumption, one of the ways is that you cut the power, of course. But if you cut the power, normally you will get a less voltage, of course. But if you also have a car that is very light, you can still have that voltage characteristic. This generation is faster than all the other Swift Sports before it, but being also lighter than not lighter than the GTIs because there was a different era, but all the safety is here, all the creature comfort is here, so that's a fantastic proposal. And that also helps you by being taxed. So for example, if you would opt for this Golf GTI, which is a class higher than this, the C class, this is the B class, the Swift Sport. In the Netherlands you will be paying over 40,000 euro. If you want to get this Polo GTI, you will pay approximately 33,000 euros. And this one became under 25,000 euros. So if you would compare it to the Golf, it's easy 50,000 euros cheaper. And if you compare it to the Polo, it's easy 8,000 euros cheaper. And if you then add the comforts that this car has, the gap will widen a lot more. So that's a thing, because if the car is too expensive, it's not attainable for the common man anymore. It's more like a sports car, where it competes with, as compared to a daily a car that can be daily driven, has practicality but is also attainable. So the only way to do that is to keep your car light, in my opinion. And that's why I really love this type of car. And if you compare it to the earlier cars, this is easily comparable and also has more interior space than the former Civics. For example, AK9 Type R has less interior room than this car has, similar dimensions, so to say. So also these classes, these smaller classes, are growing and growing. So it's not fair to compare an earlier time era B-class car with this. If you even look at the interior space, perhaps the GTI is closest to the interior space of the original Golf 1 GTI as compared to what it is now. So it can even surpass multiple classes if the time gap is long enough. So that's a point to take into consideration. You don't have to lose a lot of functionality by getting a B-class type of car. And that's, I think, the B-class is a sweet spot. And why is that for a road hatch? Because it's big enough to seat a family, so you have still the practicality. A-class could be a quite tight fit, but also it's light enough that it is attainable. And if you compare A-class and B-class, that gap was once quite big, but because also the A-class has to conform to all those taxes, especially in the Netherlands, based on mileage, the difference is not that big anymore, and then it's a completely different type of car. I'm not dissing the A-class. I think it is a nice category as well, but if you have a family, you have children, I think you will be better off, especially if they're teenagers, like I have, with a B-class. So this is quite a big rant about the B-class and also giving you the example of the Swift Sport, but I really hope that this gives you a little bit additional perspective where I'm coming from. And the funny thing is, if you look at the current best class of hot hatches, for example the best front wheel drive hot hatch, because I just explained that this is the best way to approach it in my opinion, you see that the Civic Type R of these days is beating earlier supercars such as, for example, Lamborghini Murcielago, and that is or perhaps a little bit older Lamborghini Gallardo, but they are beating them different circuits. One being the Nürburgring, and of course there are advanced tire components, and of course suspension and all this other stuff, but you get so much with a good hot hatch. And then being brought back because Civic Type R is a little bit of a top regiment, especially when you are considering front engine, front wheel drive hot hatches. I think it might be even approaching 50,000 euros in the Netherlands, so double that of this Swift Sport. But because this car is so light, if you will change a little bit, you will tweak it a little bit, upgrade it a little bit, and perhaps spend 3,000 euros or something on it to get better suspension, better exhaust, better intercooler, and perhaps also some chip tuning. You will already have a car that's very close, if not surpassing, the Civic Type R in many categories. If you will spend 5,000 euros, and you can also do suspension, perhaps some lightweight rims, and better brake pads, I think you will be outclassing the Civic Type R stock. And you could also do the same with the Civic Type R, I agree, but the Civic Type R has already 320 horsepower and 2 wheels, so 160 horsepower per wheel. That's quite the limit. Whereas if you go the route that I mentioned, you have about 180-ish horsepower. So that's only 90 horsepower per wheel, and that's a lot easier to cope with. And you could also add a limited slip differential. You could easily, with all the goodies that are available, put 10,000 euros in addition to this car, and then you will have a car with all the features that, for example, similar spec Polo GTI has, but then with probably more horsepower, especially a lot better power to weight, a far better driving experience because it's so much lighter, better braking, better suspension, and you will just have a car that can annihilate the old-time supercars. As I mentioned, this is the Gallardo on the Nürburgring. So it's something to take into consideration, and if you do so, then the price point is not that idiotic, especially because Suzuki is also very reliable, and you will still have also very good gas mileage as compared to another car with that performance because it's so light. So that was my little video about this evolution of hot hatches and the direction that I'm promoting or steering you into, and also did myself. Otherwise I would not be sitting here from this seat of the ZC33S, the current generation Swift Sport, in this case with a hybrid system also in place. Hope you have a great day, enjoy driving, and Foundry Car out.